Hopefully, you have no problems with the sound, with the connection. Again, you can use the club page at the HSE portal. Some of the questions I will not be able to convey to Alan, but we'll do that for him to look at. Perhaps he will be interested in seeking and getting answers and communicating answers. Is there a chat? Yes, there is a chat. Not between the participants, but you can write to the organizer. You mentioned the site. Yes, there is an HSE site. Hello? It's 4 o'clock. We trying to be punctual. This is the second session of the Global Economic Policy for the organizing committee. This is the time between the first and second club session was so quick, and we had a very interesting discussion, and we're going to have today. Congratulate you with the Day of the Economist. It's a pretty strange day. It was only launched in 2015. Before that, it was the Day of the Financiers, then the Economists, and then the symbol of the Imperial Free Economic Society were bees carrying something to the beehives. So what are they carrying, and to what extent it is useful? Today it is more related to the election and selection of the best economists in various nominations. That's the kind of a compensation for kind of dissatisfaction that knowledge is not easily translated into reality. And today we'll be discussing what academics, economists can do for economic policy to be higher quality. And again, what should economists should change in themselves to more effectively influence the policies? Again, there are, of course, questions on the other side. What is something we are dissatisfied with on the part of the economists? We will be discussing more the problems and issues on the side of the economist. But before we start discussing this interesting topic, I will ask you to vote. As a rule, we will vote at the very beginning and will show the results before the discussion. Please, these are the codes. You can vote in Russian and can vote in English. The first code, you go to menti.com and log in these numbers and then vote. You'll have time for voting. The most important thing, log in or write this code. And second is voting in English. The second option is in English. Let this picture stay on for some time. A few words about the time rules. And 25-30 minutes for the presentation, and then blitz Q&A, 10 minutes for everything. Because normally a question will be transformed into a comment. And we better leave more time for discussions, for which we allocate as much as 20 minutes. You can ask questions through Zoom, in the chat, to the organizers, electronically on the club site, Econ Policy HSC.ru on the HSC portal. There is a simultaneous translation with 2 channels. On 2 channels, there's only one language, either English or Russian. And now, I'm happy to present and introduce Alain Paquet, the presenter, Professor of Economics of the School of Management of the Quebec University in Montreal, specializing in macroeconomics of economic growth, regulatory fluctuations, monetary policy, fiscal policy, government debt, management, very topical issues, very relevant for any policy of any state, economic policy of any country. But most importantly, Alain Paquet was directly participating in the development and implementation of fiscal measures. Some of you may have seen the interview that Alain gave us to the HSE portal. The topic of the presentation is the academic experience on development and implementation of economic policy. Alan, what is significant, will be sharing with us all this as an academic, and on the other hand, as a politician who 2012 to 2030 was a member of the government, one of the chief advisors of the Prime Minister of the province of Quebec. Alan, you have the floor.
Здравствуйте, добрый день, коллеги. Я очень рад вашему приглашению.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm happy to have the invitation to participate in the assembly. Since my Russian is rudimentary, I can write a bit better than I can speak with little practice.
For this invitation, this occasion to exchange with you about the link or the bridge between academic economics from theory and empirical economics to the policy making itself, which I've had the great opportunity to do in part of my career. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Quebec at Montreal since 1988, but I was on leave for 9.5 years. I was on leave without pay from the university, but being a member of the Quebec National Assembly, which is the provincial parliament. And in the Canadian Federation, the provinces have many degrees of freedom and many powers in terms of economics.
I am terribly sorry, but which channel do you use? Please use channel with English.
So do you hear me now? Is that fine? Is it okay? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. So as I was saying, is that I've been I'm happy to be with you today, and although it's through the internet, to exchange with you about the link between economic theory and empirical economics to the politics and policy making itself. And so I will for the next 30 or 40 minutes, I will give you some of my of the lessons I drew from my experience in as both an academics and as a policymaker for 9.5 years while I was member of the Quebec National Assembly, which is the provincial government, the provincial parliament in Quebec. And I had been one of the main authors of the economic policy program of the Quebec Liberal Party at the time, from 1996 to 2012, as a volunteer from 1996 to 2003 until I was elected when I ran for office, and then for 9.5 years when I was member of the government. So let me share the screen, please. Here we go. Can everybody see the screen? Is it working? You can see the slides, yes? Okay, thank you. Spasiba. Great. So, so the motivation, I mean, I understand the aims and the discussion focus of the discussion economic club of HSE. And what I want to do is to give some examples and lessons in the use of theoretical and empirical macroeconomics as they may translate into policy making. So from the conception of ideas to and of policy prescription, and to base them on anchor points from academic economics. So how can we go from that to persuade and the elected and non-elected government officials to implement and to develop and to translate into practice those policy prescriptions and to implement them, and that requires, of course, the formulation of the prescription itself, the efficient communication of the issues, as well as the reasoning that underlies a government decision. So just to put in perspective, the title in English of the seminar, in English and in French, one expression which is often used is that of the being that sometimes academics are perceived, sometimes wrongly and sometimes rightly, as being in an ivory tower. And I did some research yesterday, and I found that actually there was a poem from a French literary critic and author who was first used that image, saying that sometimes people can be cut off from the real world and being in the pursuit of their own mental and esoteric purposes, and sometimes maybe out of touch from reality. And this image has been translated and used in sometimes often in North America and I think in Europe sometimes as being that academics can be sometimes cut out of the real world and being stuck in some kind of ivory pure tower, which sometimes make them disconnected from the real problems that people have to face on their day-to-day life. And so that's why I chose that title. So going from academics to policymaking could be seen as moving out of some ivory tower. But as I will try to show is in practice, I mean, I think that this image is sometimes too often misused because academics is not really most of the times in ivory towers. And that's true as well for people who do research and teaching, in which you need to be stimulated by the real issues that the world is confronting. And that's from that as economists, we try to build models which are simplifications of reality, but in order to understand better the world in which we're operating. And from that, we can translate that sometimes in terms of policy prescriptions, and even at least to say, well, government should try to avoid to do such things because the consequences that we know from economic theory and economic practice wouldn't be the ones that would be looked for by the governments and the policymakers. So even for economists who are not on the front line of policy making, I mean, I think most of the times they're not in ivory towers. It may happen to any one of us once in a while, but if you go into policymaking, suddenly you need to be moving away from being in isolation outside of the real world in which we are living in. So as Yuri summarized, I mean, I had both experience as an academics, as a full professor of economics now, and sometimes a consultant and researchers from my academic position. And in policymaking, I first was a volunteer in a political party in my young age in the other millennium in 1978, and I didn't do any politics. I wasn't involved at all. I was not involved until 1996 at the request of the leader of the Quebec Liberal Party at the time, and I became an elected official in 2003, which I held the position until 2012, and I had different positions, both as first a member of parliament, an elected official, a representative of a riding, and as a chair of the Standing Committee on Public Finance in many of those years, and as well as up to being a senior economic advisor to the Quebec Prime Minister. We call Premier in Canada as being the Prime Minister of Quebec. For all those years I was in Parliament, and I was at times State Minister for Finance and member of the Government Committee on Economic Prosperity and Sustainable Development. And as well, sometimes in previous years, I was a Parliamentary Secretary to the Quebec Premiers and the Minister of Finance and so on. So now, it turns out that at the University of Quebec at Montreal in the economics department, since 2003, there have been 4 examples of colleagues or students who became policymakers, and they ended up being in 4 different political parties. So there could be some difference in some normative views, but I would say that all of them were certainly, I mean, good economists and tried to formulate and develop their prescriptions as a policy, first of all, the good economists. I mean, I for one, I was a state minister for finance. Another colleague of mine has been minister of finance in a government that succeeded the government I was a member of. The current minister of finance of Quebec is a former MA student who had a career in the private sector for a while, and now he's a minister of finance. And in the last federal election, one of my colleagues just became member of one of the opposition party in the House of Commons in Ottawa. So going back now to some economic principles that guide the implications in implementation of economic policy. I mean, of course, you're pretty familiar with the description of positive economics and normative economics. And positive is a description of what will happen under some assumptions, given our state of knowledge and the empirical evidence we have. And that's one important dimension. It's an objective dimension, but there's also normative economics, which is a more normative which is normative definition, dimensions and a subjective dimension per se, which is rather to judge on what should happen, what do we want it to be. So what is the goals to perceive, and that represents some values. It could be greater efficiency, it could be greater equity, it could be many things in that regard. Another important concept of economics we need to keep in mind in policymaking is the opportunity cost, as well as the important thing is that economic agents, no matter who they are on this planet, I think if there's one thing on which economics is perfectly right, and there's not that many things, obviously, is the fact that individuals, men and women, respond to incentives, good and bad incentives, in order to basically, when they make the decisions, of course, we need to figure out what are the objectives they're pursuing, what is the objective function, what are the constraints they are facing, and what are the optimal choices that they make under those constraints. And some of those constraints may represent like budget constraints, they may represent some frictions that we need to face, some different costs that we need to face. Another key principle is that of expectations, because the expectations matter in order to understand the effects and the impact of a policy. In particular, this has implications for the credibility of policies. If people think the policy is not credible, the results that will come out of this policy will not be necessarily those that were intended. And the issue of time consistency of policy also is under this topics of expectations. Now, what can we say about the principles of some principles of policymaking? First of all, you need from the genesis of political ideas that often are brought about from dealing with or solving some issues and problems that are faced by our society. So that's important first to define correctly the problems, both in terms of the scope and the depth of those problems. It's also important to identify the peoples that are being impacted by the situation, by the problem, as well as by the prescriptions that may be put into effect. It could be a community, a region, a province, a whole country, the world. And also, in terms of the gist of political ideas, the idea of the policy idea that can be inspired or guided by the challenges, some visions that are rooted in certain values, some guiding principles, thinking, research, reaction, feedback of current economic developments, as well as some reports coming from official or task force and so on, as well as social pressures. All this describes, I think, some of the key parameters in which political ideas or prescriptions are born. A good policy, whether it's in terms of social, economic, or environmental policy, must take into account several dimensions, from its conception up to its implementation. We need first to adjudge adequately the situation. We need to set realistic goals, to assess the financial and human resources that will be required to address this problem, as well as to set some prospective implementation schedule with some well-defined milestones. In that sense, a significant level of success for a policy will require qualitative as well as sometimes quantitative indicators. They need some proper governance as well as proper appropriate incentives for all the actors that are involved and concerned by the policy. Some of the principles that I've discovered I will formulate from my experience as representative to advance political ideas and policy ideas is, first, it's important to have a well-assembled case with rigorous and credible arguments, and recognizing both strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons of any proposals. So always we have to balance many inconveniences when decisions have to be made. Of course, it doesn't mean we'll win all the battles. I mean, you will lose some and win some, but the idea is at least to give a better chance to be able to implement a policy. This is a good starting point. It's also important to identify the interlocutors with whom you'll be interacting, because often they will be reliable conveyors for a proposed policy. It's important that they understand the issues as well as to set the record straight, whether they like it or not. It's important to also identify the potential support as well as the potential opposition to a policy. there's some other principles that I formulated. Is that one of my former students told me once I had to be a multilingual to be in the policy making, and he didn't mean in terms of speaking Russian, French, or English. It meant that, I mean, in order when you to formulate a policy and you defend it, it's important to translate the issue as well as prescription in different ways. It doesn't mean you need to change. It certainly doesn't mean that you have to change the speech or discourse depending on whom you talk. You have to have the same discourse, the same prescription, the same description of reality, but you need to be able to formulate it in a way which is understandable. Whether you're talking to colleagues in parliament, whether you're talking to the member of governments, to the journalists, to non-elected officials in the civil service, to the population. So depending whom you talk to, it's important that you're able to translate the same idea, the same speech in ways which can have a useful discussion and debate to be able to describe and to implement, to develop and implement a policy. One of the paradoxes we're facing is that of short-term versus long-term in the following way. As we know, is that what is true in personal affairs, in business affairs, or in policy making, bad decisions have long-lasting effects. However, good decisions don't have instantaneous effects. It takes time before we see all the effects. And of course, in a government context, and this paradox is a constraint sometimes and may bring some distortions in reality. Another principle I've discovered is that what I call the acupuncture principle. In the sense that, I mean, in acupuncture, you need to put, for what I understand of it, I mean, I'm not a specialist of that, is that you need to set the needles in the right place, in the right spot. If those needles are not placed in the right place, if they are not, if you forget to put one of those needles and it is missing, then the current will not flow, which will be also constraint that you'll be facing in doing policymaking. And then another, and maybe last principle I formulated is that of the jigsaw puzzle principle. It says that, let's say that we're 10 people and we have to complete the picture from this jigsaw puzzle, and each of us play with only half of our pieces, and we're playing on different puzzles. Of course, we won't get anywhere. So it's important to try to get everybody to work all the pieces on the table and to work on the same puzzle. And that's another one experience. I would have many examples I could give of my experience when I was a member of parliament. So I will give some examples. I will take 3 of them today, examples to bridge the gap between academics and I would say and policy making. I could have more, and some of them, depending on your interest, we can go to some other examples in the future, because I worked on for instance on the Quebec strategy of entrepreneurship, the first one. I was the main author of it. I work in the research innovation policy as well, and there are some examples in which I was directly at the origin of some of those policies, but not all of them, obviously. And I will take 2 of them in which I was directly involved from the birth of the concept of the ID to implementation, and one wasn't the originator of the ID, but I think was an important policy making example, on which I was not involved in defining it, but I was involved in developing, at least in defending it, and in the implementation of that policy. So a first example is that of in Quebec. That was in 1981. I mean, at the time, the Quebec economy was hit by a very tough and hard recession. The real GDP dropped by 3.73%, which was one of the most important recessions, except of course the COVID, which was shorter. The 1981-1982 recession lasted about a year, a little bit less than a year, but really was very hard for the economy. Unemployment raised to the roof. The government budget deficit of provincial government increased by 5.84%. And part of the explanation was also the fact that, for instance, like the government receipts or tax revenues from taxing profits of corporations, of course, went down significantly. As you know, during business cycles, I mean, investment is very volatile. And so when you're hit by a recession, profits melt down. And of course, if the government is taxing profits, which it was doing and it does, then government receipts go down. So even if government spending didn't increase, and it did increase as well, and other government receipts didn't go down, and they went down as well, then of course, a budget deficit balloons out, and government deficit increases, and public debt increases very much so. At the time, the Minister of Finance, who was an economist from training. He had a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics from 1955, and a very smart person. I mean, I wasn't of the same political current as his. I mean, I had some different view on many things, but I mean, he's a very smart and very clever economist. However, I mean, his training and his experience and training of the civil service at the time was strongly based on old-fashioned first-round models of Keynesian economics. Of course, he understood that in a recession, you had to have a budget deficit. The problem wasn't there. But one concern that the Minister of Finance at the time had, Mr. Parizeau had, is that, well, I mean, given that profits of corporations are very volatile, this implies, and his reasoning was that this implies that government receipts from taxing corporate incomes is very volatile. He didn't like that. So what he says, what I'm going to do, he said, is that I will decrease significantly the tax on profits, on corporate income of corporations. But instead of taxing profits as much, I will put in place and I will increase significantly a tax on the value of capital. Basically, what the tax was doing is to tax the value of the building, the value of the physical assets, machinery and equipment, as well as taxing the long-term debt incurred by the corporations on the basis that long-term debt was used to build the capital stock. Because in the short terms, most corporations that are facing that tax on capital will not destroy their own capital. They won't take baseball bat to destroy this capital in order to be taxed on it, because they need physical capital to produce goods and services, especially goods. For that reason, then, I mean, that means that the tax base that was defined by the tax on physical capital was much less volatile, at least in the short term. However, that meant that even though in the short term, for most corporations, I mean, they couldn't do anything to escape that tax. What happened is that as time went by, they did replace the capital that was depreciating. Therefore, over time, the physical stock of capital in Quebec went down significantly, which put an important drag on output growth, on real GDP growth, as well as on the level of growth, the levels rather of GDP. Just to give some perspective on it, that is that, I mean, and from some report I wrote in 1996 and another report in 1998, which just took the same numbers. Basically, in 1998, when I looked at the situation, so it was 17 years later than from the implementation of that important tax, and that was about the same values since 1981. You see the tax on corporate income in Quebec, in the province of Quebec, was generally way lower than in the rest of the country, in the other provinces. Whether it's on manufacturing transformation, so in Quebec, 8.9% instead of 13.5%, for instance, in Ontario, which is our closest province, which has a similar economic structure, or fairly similar economic structure than the province of Quebec. Well, the tax on capital, the capital tax rate in Quebec was 0.64 of 1% of the value of capital. So 0.64 seems a small rate, but the tax base is huge. So this brought a lot of revenues for the government in that regard. Well, in other provinces like in Ontario, that tax rate was less than half of 0.64. In some provinces, even it was 0%. So, and there are other taxes, but that's basically the ones I wanted to talk about. So this tax, my understanding of economics and from economic theory and principles, said, I mean, it was the worst tax you can imagine. And I will give you some other illustration of that. Now, around the same time, in 1997, American economists Tom Cooley and Leo Anian, Tom Cooley was a former teacher of mine, had published a paper in the Journal of Political Economics, where he looked at they compared the evolution of output growth in Britain and the United States from the end, or from the let's say from the end of, or right around the Second World War, but from the end of the Second World War up to the 1990s. You see that from 1939 to 1959, Here is a normalized output. You just put an index of it to put on the same, in the same, of real GDP in both countries on the same footing, real output. And you see that basically the US economy, of course, had a strong growth during the war. The growth, and then after the war, it started growing again. While in Britain, you see that the growth and the level of UK GDP was lower than in the United States. If you look at the ratio of US investment to output compared to UK of private investment to output, you can see that, I mean, until the early 1970s, basically, the share of private investment in output was way lower in UK than in the United States. And basically what Cooley and Orient show, and they show it first by documenting what happened and what John Maynard Keynes proposed at the time. And thank goodness the British government didn't implement all the policy that Keynes was proposing, because even Keynes was proposing to implement a capital levy to tax 100% of profits after the war. Of course, I mean, if the government said, well, I'm doing it only once, I will never do it again, and if people believed it, the damage wouldn't be that bad on the economy. But obviously, people understood that if one did it once, he would do it again and again and again. So they didn't implement the whole prescription that Keynes proposed at the time, because Keynes basically didn't have much consideration for expectations of economic agents in the decision. That's one of the weakness of Keynes' view. There's so many things, but that was not as well understood at the time. So, but I mean, implementing the policy that Keynes proposed had some impact on the level of output in the UK. Well, look at it in Quebec now. In Quebec, actually, I mean, if you look at the number from 1991 to 1998, here's the share of private investment, private physical investment in Quebec, in Canada, for Quebec and Ontario. And of course, Quebec's a smaller economy than Ontario, which Quebec was about a 23% share of Canadian GDP, 21% of Canadian GDP rather, while Ontario is 41%. But you see the share of private investment in Quebec is lower and way lower than compared to the share of the economy that was in 1998. And you see that from 1981 to 1998, private investment, its share went down by 11%. Compared to 6% in Ontario over the same period. And here's the exercise I did, which is a bit similar to what has done Cooley and Leroy. I said, let's normalize real GDP in Canada, in Quebec, and in Ontario, and in Canada on average, to 100 in 1971. And let's see what was the observed growth of the economy over that period. Well, here's the blue line is the Quebec evolution of cumulative growth that was observed from 71 to 1987, while for the whole country, for Canada overall, it's the black line, which is underneath the green line here, which are both are basically the same for Ontario and Canada. New Brunswick is an eastern province, a smaller province in Quebec, and a bit poorer province in Quebec in terms of GDP per capita. And you see that if Quebec had the same growth rate then the average that the whole of Canada over the same period, the Quebec economy would have had a 19.5% higher real GDP than what we have had. So there may be more than one explanation behind that, but one of the explanations I postulated was the fact that we had this huge tax rate on the value of capital, which is the worst kind of taxes you can think in terms of financing given government level of spending. And actually, in theory, economic theory has shown that if you compare the impact in terms of welfare losses on the economy of various taxes, if you compare the capital tax, corporate income tax rate, personal income tax, or like labor income tax, payroll tax, user fees, or value-added type tax, tax of consumption, all taxes are not equal to the impact on welfare and the level of performance of an economy. The most damaging tax for a given level of revenues is a tax on capital, for the tax on corporate income tax, and so on. And the least damaging tax is a tax on consumption. Of course, the idea is that, any taxes has some impact on the economy. It doesn't mean taxes should be zero because we want some government spending. We may debate sometimes which program we want, but for a given level of government expenditure, a government needs to finance it. So the optimal fiscal policy is to choose the menu of taxation and the tax bases and the combination of tax bases, which are the least damageable to the economy for a given amount of revenues that needs to be collected from the economy. Well, the estimates of the Quebec government, I have numbers from 2010 here at the time, were that, I mean, if the government was to increase its tax receipts by $1, it would be $1 million, I'm just normalizing to $1, the long-term impact on real GDP would be decreasing real GDP of $1.37. If you choose the corporate income tax, the level would be 89 cents for every dollar for an extra dollar collected from the tax on profits. A tax on labor income is 76 cents. A tax on value-added tax is 28 cents. I mean, I don't think we should take those numbers as being exactly the perfect number, that's a perfect measure of the impact, but the ranking is robust, and let's say the relative order of magnitude is fairly robust as well. So when we're government, we worked on estimating the impact, which confirmed what I had proposed as an academic economist at the time. So in 1996, I was the first economist in Quebec to propose to eventually abolish this tax. And when we were elected in 2003, I mean, we couldn't overnight say, let's abolish it overnight, because of course, I mean, we would have cut important government revenues for the government. But the idea was to build and implement a policy which would get rid of that tax eventually. So what we did in the short term is we decided to implement some tax rebates and accelerated fiscal depreciations in order to increase and to stimulate and incentivize to invest. And eventually in 2010, we abolished the capital tax for the manufacturing sector. And in 2011, we abolished it for all sectors of the economy except for financial institutions. And I can go back details about that because we couldn't tax it the same way in that regard. So this was an example of an implementation, but I had to debate obviously with tax lawyers, for instance, who said, well, I mean, the government cannot do that because we're going to if we abolish this tax, we're going to be losing revenues. Well, yeah, but tax lawyers didn't take into account, and the government in the past didn't take into account that because we had such a high tax rate, which was detrimental for the Quebec economy, over time, the stock of capital tax base was shrinking and GDP was shrinking. So wages for workers were lower than would have been. Profits for corporations were lower than they would have been. Therefore, government receipts were lower than they would have been. So this had the impact of the older tax system that we had. So that's an example in which I was involved in terms of the gist of the idea, in terms of the implementation of that idea. Let me give you, for sake of time, let me give you maybe a second example, and maybe I will go quickly on the third example, and if we can go in more details in the exchange if you have some interest to that. So another example was the implementation of an earned income tax credit for lower income and lower middle income workers. In Quebec, for quite some time, since the early 70s, we have many programs for individuals and households to support income for their lower income families. Especially like some people who are not eligible to unemployment insurance or unemployed. Some people who are out of the labor market, so they are not in the labor force, and they have no revenues from working or anything. So there is a social assistance program of the Quebec government that provides a monthly amount and as well as various special benefits that if you're on that programs, you have some free dental care and dentures, you have free exams, eye exams, free glasses and contact lenses, free medical transportations and medications, as well as some moving expenses. So which is quite an advantage program, which gives some basic, of course, it doesn't make you a millionaire, but gives you some basic level of revenues in order to be able to have some basic life for your family. And there is other programs for having kids and so on, but I mean, I'm focusing only on the social welfare program here. So for instance, in 2021, for a person with no limited capacity for unemployment, the social assistance program would pay about $8,500 per month, as well as an extra $1,200 per year if you have if your rent for sheltering is an important share of your revenues, as well as the benefits I described. Now, the problem, the issue we had, and that I proposed in 1996 and 1998 rather, was that that for such family, if they decide to go to work and accept a job at a lower wage income, then they have to abandon, of course, they're moving out of the social assistance program. Because of that, means, if they lose more than they gain from going on the labor market, it's not because they're abusing the system, They just have a disincentive to go into the labor market, which has, of course, consequences for the self-esteem of the people in terms of getting experience and also improving their income and their welfare for the family over time. So the issue is, how could we lower poverty, assist low-income households, and at the same time increase the incentive to work? So one possibility would have been to increase the statutory minimum hourly wage rate. In 1998, the minimum wage rate was $6.98 or $6.98 per hour, compared to the average wage in Quebec at the time of $15.50 basically. So this represents minimum wage represented about something like about 43% of the average wage rate. So some people and unions will say, well, we should be increasing minimum wage. The same debate actually is occurring again now. Things come back sometimes. And some people say, no, let's raise the wage. I mean, at a very high minimum wage, so people will be better off. The problem is that, I mean, if you increase that minimum wage too high, of course, and the problem is that, I mean, lower income wage positions and occupations and vacancies will disappear or will decrease significantly. It'll be harder for them to get a job if firms think it costs too much to pay that statutory minimum wage. So yeah, you want to have a statutory minimum wage, but I mean, you don't want it to be so high compared to the average wage rate that basically you destroy jobs and then you make everybody worse off in that context. You may have, of course, I mean, this year, David Card was one of the recipient of the Nobel Prize in economics. I mean, he had done in the 1984 important working published paper article, he showed that sometimes increasing minimum wage wasn't bad for job employment compared, even though it was the consensus among economists until then. But however, we have to take into account that even David Card never said, I mean, the minimum wage should go to 60-80% of the average wage. Basically, the interpretation of his work and subsequent work is that, I mean, you should be somewhere around or below 50% of the average wage if you don't want to be too detrimental for the available position and jobs for low income and less skilled, less specialized skilled workers. Now, what we did instead, we said, okay, let's keep we're going to index the minimum wage. We want to keep a reasonable minimum wage and not to go overboard with it. But in order to help people with lower income and to incentivize to work, we, based on a book by Edmund Phelps, another Nobel Prize in economics, I and some other people, and I was the one of that who brought this idea, and what we should be implementing is a work premium, or the program is called the work premium, was an income tax credit, which basically give an additional tax credit, which is non-taxable, for people who work full time, or at least work a significant portion of time of the week. And this program is the parameters are adjusted. If you have children, you'll be more generous than if you don't have children. If you're two members of a household versus a single individual, the parameters will be different. So to give an example of that program, basically, is that if someone was at a minimum wage today of $13.10 and was working 36 hours per week for 52 weeks, and a child, I mean, their labor income would be $24,500 right now. The program that we've implemented in 1998, which has been improved also over time, and in 2003 rather, and became into effect in 2005, that program, which was based on the idea I proposed in 1998, now, I mean, it would pay as a work premium for the same family, would add to the labor income an extra $2,500 from that program. And this program is paid monthly, $211 per month from the Quebec government. And there are some other programs so that we improve also the share of the lower income families. And even after we implemented this program in Quebec, at the federal level, they implemented a similar program with the parameters somewhat different, but the same idea is there. So basically, I mean, the two programs together, for the example I gave, is instead of only earning $24,000, $24,500 per year, the same family earns basically an extra $5,000 net of tax, which is added to this family. So that makes it more interesting to work than remaining on the social assistance program. Even though you're losing some benefits from it, then it's an incentive to work and to go to the labor market at the same time as it pursues an equity goal as well as an efficiency goal for the economy. So that's an example in which, I mean, from economic theory and empirical evidence, we designed the policy, and we're able to build that. I mean, at first there were some debates about it. Now every political parties in the parliament agree with the program, and they kept improving the program over time. So that's another example. So I could talk also about the Quebec Generation Funds. Let me just summarize in 2 or 3 sentences. Basically, Quebec was the highest indebted provincial government in Canada. And even compared to the world, I mean, like total debt, let's say in 2004, for instance, if you include a share of federal debt and provincial debt together compared to other countries, so in Canada, Quebec, only provincial debt was the highest debt. 44% of GDP in Quebec was the public government debt of Quebec government. If you take compared to the OECD countries 2004, I mean, you see including the share of federal debt, where we were one of the highest debt GDP ratio in the OECD countries. And what happened in the 1970s, the governments, no matter whether we were in recession or not, were incurring important debt. They were financing current operation expenditures by increasing debt and not increasing taxes as much. So basically, we're building in a structural deficit, which meant no matter the state of the economy, deficits will be piling up and the debt will be increasing in relation to GDP. So, of course, Quebec government was not the only one in the world who did that, but it was bad policy prescription. Economics theory tells you that, I mean, of course, if you have a recession or if a temporary increase in government expenditure, you don't want to raise taxes and cut spending badly. So what you want to do, you want to occur deficits for temporary situations. But over the middle term or the medium term, then you need to balance the current operation budgets. You may borrow, of course, to finance productive public investment. That debt is a good kind of a good debt. But a bad debt would be to keep incurring a budget deficits no matter what the state of the economy is. So it's like a good cholesterol and bad cholesterol with good debt and bad debt in that regard. But we had accumulated bad debt for many, many years, and to a point where even the public debt to GDP ratio was way too high. And this had an impact, of course, on the credit rating of the Quebec government, the cost of borrowing for the Quebec government, as well as the share of the budget of expenditures which had to go to not to education or to welfare or to health expenditure, but had to go to finance the debt services or interest on the outstanding public debt. So what the government did basically is we decided to implement a policy which called the Quebec Generation Funds, in which the Quebec government would put aside every year and would borrow sometimes, it would borrow at a lower rate than the average return on a fund, on a well-balanced fund, not too risky fund, managed by the Caisse de Dépôt, which is a big government institution, which basically, which is independent of the government, which is a government agency, but independent of the policymakers mostly, not totally, but mostly, and which manage independently, like the pension funds of the public pension funds of the Quebec society, as well as the one from the public sectors as well. And on average, a return from that fund is higher than the cost of borrowing. But the government basically committed itself to put aside money year after year, and when that fund increased so significantly, it takes it that this money can be used only to decrease debt directly. So of course the government agencies, the credit agencies take that into account when they assess the state of the public debt in Quebec. And this fund is financed by royalties from Hydro-Quebec, which is the main monopoly, state monopoly who produces electricity in Quebec, from revenues generated by the indexation of the basic heritage price of electricity for typical households, the mining revenues, as well as some other tax like or an investment income of the government. So dedicated funds are used not only to finance any occurring spending over a year, but is financed to go to this fund in order to decrease debt to GDP over time. And it worked. Not only it was a correction that we thought made sense when I wasn't at the origin of it, but I defended it when we implemented it. I mean, but not only was a good idea, but in practice, we see that even prior to the COVID, of course, because then the size increased significantly over the last year. Prior to COVID, you see the debt GDP ratio went down from 48.2% now and to 44.6% in 2021. That is before the COVID. I mean, and that meant, and the objective was to bring it to less than 45%, and it worked out. So the cumulative deficits from bad debt relative to GDP was significantly put down. So, in conclusion, I believe that finally theoretical and empirical economics are not disconnected from real world issues for society. Whether we are on the front line or not, as academics, we're not necessarily, and mostly we're not in an ivory tower. This is shown by development of modern macroeconomics in the last 40 years, like dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models and micro foundation and so on. And it's also shown, I think, in terms of policy examples, as the one, for instance, the example that I gave today. And we could talk about monetary policy right now, which is an interesting debate in Canada, United States, and many countries in the post-COVID, hopefully soon post-COVID era. So sound economic policy ought to rely on solid, positive economic reasoning. There are some principles and lessons that can be drawn from various examples in many places and times. I gave some from Quebec, and insights from direct interactions with officials, whether they're elected or not, journalists, constituents, and stakeholders are important in that regard. Of course, there are some challenges. People sometimes lose their trust in institutions. We see that in the United States. We see it in Canada as well. In Quebec, not as much, but it's part of it. The information ecosystem has changed with the social networks. So this makes some challenges to get the sound economics to the idea. And I would add, of course, then the idea is not to move from an ivory tower to another one. So it's important to be well grounded, and I think that economists are mostly. But government also, it's important that government don't become themselves an ivory tower, and they have to remain very grounded on the reality of that people are the constituents and our citizens, our citizens, and are living in reality. So the idea is not to move from one ivory tower to another one, but both government and academics to be well involved in the issues we're facing. Большое спасибо. So,
Alan, большое спасибо.
Thank you very much, Alan. Your last words are a New Year toast. Toast for the new year. Now a short session for Q&A. But before that, if you can put up a picture of voting to keep it for some time. We need, if you can switch off the presentation. If you can switch off the presentation. Alan, can you remove the presentation, the slide, for some time? Alan? Alan, can you remove the presentation? Once they show you go to Menticom and vote, you remember. Alan, can you remove the presentation? Can you switch it off? Can you switch off the presentation for Alan, for us to show the voting? While we are going through the procedure of switching off the presentation, the slides, let me read out some questions. We have several chat questions and some personal questions. First, interesting question from Natalia Ivanova, a full member of the Academy of Sciences of Russia. Natalia is asking, yes, you are justly saying, Alan, incentives work. That's what history teaches us and theory. But what incentives, which incentives work better? Sticks or carrot? Threats or gifts? Reducing taxes or increasing taxes? Brief answer, Alan.
Alan, вы слышите нас?
Alan? 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 Alan?
Да, на английском, конечно.
Алану надо просто переключиться в другой.
У нас синхронный перевод, пожалуйста, переключитесь на английский.
Yeah, switch over to English, whoever is listening in English. And the question was, which incentives work better? carrots or sticks, reducing taxes or increasing taxes, threats or gifts. Did you hear the translation, Alan? Did you hear the translation of the question? What works better? Tax incentives? Which tax incentives? Increasing taxes work better or reducing taxes works better? Which is more efficient, more effective?
How do I switch to the English channel? Sorry, I don't get.
Надо
I'm not sure I can switch to the English channel.
Can you hear the English channel? Can you hear English? Can you hear English? Can you hear English? Can you hear English?
I don't think I've been informed about how to do that. Oh, interpretation, okay, I get it. Okay.
Отлично.
It works now. Sorry, now I got the English channel. Sorry about that. Извините.
Хорошо, тогда я вам могу задать вопрос теперь. Да?
Let me ask the question then in English, okay? In Russian
Sure.
and English.
Окей. Значит, вопрос следующий.
The question is, which incentives work better? Gifts or threats, carrots or sticks, reducing taxes or increasing taxes?
Well, a good question. I mean, of course, people respond to both carrots and sticks, and we all prefer carrots than sticks, obviously. I guess it depends on which situation we're talking about. Like, for instance, in terms of incentivize to go to the labor market, I think the issue is, in terms of optimal fiscal policy, the idea is that since any taxes create some distortions, which has some welfare impact on the economy in terms of efficiency, the idea is to find the right mix of taxes. That means, for instance, and we know that the higher the tax rates, the highest, and it's not linear. It's not a linear function. It's even proportional to the square of the marginal tax rates. The higher the tax rates, the higher the negative impact on the economy. So the idea is to find the right mix of tax rate and tax base for a given amount of revenues a government needs to implement or to finance a given level of government expenditure. That means to find the right mix which decreases that negative efficiency effect, while taking into account, of course, some equity effect as well. But
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
One example, perhaps, for instance, if you talk, for instance, like to incentivize to work, you don't want to have a tax rate which is too high. You want to have the taxes were less damageable for the economy. However, if you want, for instance, to decrease the consumption of oil, for instance, we're talking about the climate change issues right now, then for the sticks is important to decrease the amount of pollution which is supplied in the world. So in that sense, like a carbon tax or a caps and trade system, which gives a price to the externality of pollution, therefore the sticks is, in this case, is a better application.
Alan, спасибо.
Alan, thank you very much. The next question. You've talked much about the importance of long-term perspective, but all the governments, they have short-term, medium-term perspective. Given your experience, how do you encourage governments, specific officials, decision makers to orient themselves by long-term prospects?
You're right, you read. It's a very important challenge and tough challenge we have to face. Even when elections, like in Canada, elections are every 4 years at the provincial and federal government. In the United States, sometimes every 2 years. That makes it even more difficult. At the same time, we want to have the right the right governance. That means that the government has to respond and of its policies towards the population at some point. Now, in that context, one key factor, which is somewhat exogenous sometimes, is that of having a leader of a government, having a party who has a long-term vision and it wants to face issues about that. And of course, that varies. I would say, like in Canada, I'm not talking elsewhere, but in Canada, I would say that, I mean, I think that the visions right now are more short term than they used to. Of course, I mean, the COVID crisis is part of the explanation. I mean, COVID is a very urgent situation we need to face. But even before the COVID, it seems that given, I think, the new economic system of information we're in, one of the problems is that I think the short-termism is taking a little bit more effect than it used to have, at least in the last, at least before, let's say, 2010, 2011, 2012. That would be my observation. Now, one way to do that, then, in that case, is sometimes for government with some visions, sometimes you need to implement some laws that basically bind the ends of future government. So, for instance, the generation funds was put into law. Of course, could be changed by a new government. But I mean, given the cost incurred by the credit agencies that we would have to face if a government decided to abolish the generation funds and spend it, even though the current government, which is not the same party I was involved in at the time, even though when they were in the position, said, well, we're going to abolish it to do something with it, when they arrived in government, they said, well, no, the political cost of changing it or abolishing it is too bad, it's too high. So that means that when you implement some laws that bind to some extent the ends of future governments, this help to discipline future governments. So that's one of the challenges. But of course, one exogenous effect that sometimes is hard to control is the fact that, I mean, depending population, I mean, they want to have short-term results in themselves. So governments represent the people in that sense. But it's always a big challenge to face. I mean, in policymaking. You're right.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Следующий вопрос я предоставлю возможность.
The next question, Lev Jakobson, Vice President of HSE.
Я попросил возможность задать вопрос устно, потому что, я не могу его сформулировать очень коротко, но это именно вопрос, это не выступление в дискуссии, может быть, еще выступ. Прежде всего, я хотел бы очень высоко оценить доклад, действительно замечательный доклад, и вместе с тем высоко оценить усилия Алена.
The efforts of Alan and the company enabled them to meet a number of challenges quite important for the people of Quebec. I noted that we received some cases from Alan, and those cases were telling us the way political decisions were proposed and implemented. And in fact, they can be presented or can be delivered through some popular magazines, media. But for those who work mostly in the ivory tower, they mostly face with other type of issues which cannot be tackled this way. I can mention only two. One of them was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. That's multilingual approach, a lot of dimensions. And the other, and it's not the last one, is quite known for economists. Economics is mostly about trade-offs. We all remember the joke of a one-handed economist, because from the standpoint of science, responding to politicians' requests, the answer would be, are we selling or buying? But those things cannot be published in media. So my question is, Alan, could you think of some cases of not those breakthrough recommendations that worked? Of course, I understand there were some trade-offs too, but reasonably. But could you think of some cases or situations when, as an academic or politician, you have to deal with a situation that you can really offer a dual approach and say that from one hand it can be this way and from the other hand it could be that way. It's a temptation always for the economists who work out of the ivory tower. The science knows only part of the answer to a question. The other part is presented to me as a person, as an individual. I understand. I hope you understood the question, although it's quite a complex question for those who stay out of that ivory tower, and I deal with the issues on a daily basis. Thank you.
Oh, Spasiba. That's a good question. You're right that I mean that I mentioned the idea of being multilingual. I mean, you need to be able to then translate the same idea, the same issues, the pros and cons, as I mentioned, of every issue. And of course, I mean, we win some battles and we lose some. As long as fundamental principles of our values are not attacked by it, I mean, say, well, okay, well, I lost that one. I could give you some example. I lost an election over one issue actually. I mean, the government I was more a member of, we lost an election on the tuitions of university tuitions actually in 2012, and there were and we. I can get into that if you're interested at some point, but I mean, but at least we defended it in front of the population, and democracy ruled the day, and I respect that, even though we lost the battle, but and I lost some. But to give an example about those trade-offs, sometimes those trade-offs, I mean, are in terms of economics perspective, but sometimes it's economic. There's other goals that are pursued by the government, representing what the people sometimes want. I mean, people want a lot of things, and the foundation of the existence of economics is the fact that the needs of people are unlimited, while the resources to respond to those needs are limited. And that's why there is a choice. There are choices to be made. One example in which I mean that was the issue of a free trade, for instance. Economists since David Ricardo know, and it hasn't been unproven, neither theoretically nor empirically, that by and large, a freer trade across nations is welfare improving for all nations overall. That being said, not everybody will gain as much from freer trade. We've seen one of the great progresses, the extreme poverty, which is way too prevalent still now, has decreased significantly over the last 100 years, the last 40 years, 20 years, especially 30 years, with world globalization and freer trade. Of course, there are still too much extreme poverty. I'm not saying everything is resolved, but I mean, one important factor to decrease it has been freer trade, by and large. But of course, the temptation in every country, this is true in Canada, as in the United States and elsewhere, is something say, well, yeah, but there are exceptions. This industry has to be protected. We saw President Trump, I mean, like for instance, implementing policies that put tariffs on steel and aluminum, and wood and lumber wood, which impacted negatively on the Canadian economy, the Quebec economy, and impacted on the cost of housing in the United States for the Americans. The tariffs that were raised by President Trump were paid by the Americans. You know, were they paid by the Chinese or by the European or by Canadians mostly? They were paid directly by the Americans. But now, in that context, there was a debate, and one of the reasons the debate occurred is that many people, I mean, even though it wasn't a majority, of course, had been hardly hit by the transition toward a more globalized economy. In some sectors of the economy, with economic progress, some sectors like coal industry, for instance, some lower tech steel industries or plants in the United States became less efficient over time. And of course, and the economic hardship that the people, the workers, those sectors faced, I mean, had an impact on political results, as we saw in elections over the recent while, and also had impact on the economy. So in that trade-off, one of the things that sometimes, in one hand, on the other hand, that the economists, in a sense, I mean, failed up to a point, is that even though we knew and we said, we think the overall gains from freer trade is good for everybody, and we could take some of those gains and use it to have a transition to help the people, the workers who are hit by and they were in artificially protected sector before, and they are hit by the transition to a free economy. The governments fail, and maybe economists failed to promote enough to the importance to implement those transitory measures. I would think that's one example that comes to my mind. I would think that towards the climate change issue we're facing worldwide now, and the idea of that eventually we'll be moving in towards a less oil resource economy. But in the meantime, it doesn't mean we cannot say, even though I think we need to raise the price of through carbon tax worldwide. I mean, we cannot say that overnight we're going to stop cold turkey. We're going to stop producing oil. The issue is we need to find ways to decrease the negative impact on the economy and move towards maybe electric-based cars and so on, and support and decrease the production of oil. But there will be some transitions. We need to help the people be affected by that, the countries that be affected by that. So that's an example of the one end on the other end, where we need to be able to confront those issues. And I would conclude on that, on my answer at this point, and saying that, I mean, one thing is that economic progress of our knowledge, sometimes the progress we made on some things we thought we understood, sometimes we didn't understand them that well. And I think recognizing the limitation of our knowledge is a progress in itself. And we need to be able to build that up in our working and defining of solutions to the problems we're facing. But you're right, Mr. President, that it's of the university, it's a tough issue sometimes, often, not all the time.
Спасибо.
Thanks a lot. Well, dear colleagues, I have to stop Q&A since anyway, it has turned into a discussion. And perhaps starting from the next session, we will quit from Q&A, because Q&A evolves as a discussion. You cannot give a short answer. So now we are moving on to a discussion. But before that, let's see the outcome of voting. Can you see the picture? That's my comment. Those who have problems to read and for Alan benefits. So number one, problems in identifying arguments, and problems with identifying approaches. And I think it's a bad tooth. Economists somehow believe that all reasoning is to be quite clear, and by doing so, they start mentoring. They start talking like teachers with kids when they talk to public servants or elected officials. So to improve the situation, they'd better switch to another language. And the Russian Minister of Finance many times disliked any drafts on taxes, and many times they didn't like it because of the stimulus incentives that are unpredictable for the future. So we can think of other expectations that can be quite clear, but it's not the case with taxes. And now it's time to start the discussion. Look at the slide. Dear colleagues, please turn off your mics. I think the first comment can be made by Charlie Bronke, a representative of the World Bank, the leader of the macroeconomist group, a well-known person, distinguished person. So the floor is yours, please.
So thank you, Spasiba. I hope you can hear me well. Yes, we can hear you.
I am so sorry I cannot speak Russian, which is a beautiful language, but my children speak Russian. So at least I have that proud in the family. And so I think my colleagues also at the bank, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's really a privilege to be here and also to listen to Professor Alain Paquet and to this exchange. I think what I'm leading actually a team on macro fiscal and sustainable growth. And we are obviously at this point in time, particularly focused on countries post-COVID-19 recovery and how countries have chosen or which path of recovery they're choosing. And so, as you know, the World Bank has made revised the climate change action plan, which is very ambitious. But more importantly, equally importantly, I should say, but I think what I want to emphasize is the green, resilient, and inclusive growth approach that we want to promote in this recovery phase. And I would like to stress not only the green. I heard already Professor Paquet, he certainly emphasized the need to move towards a decarbonized path, but also the inclusive path. Inclusive meaning, therefore, that we know as before, that actually there has been an increase in poverty within countries, not just across poor, not just across or between high income and low income, but what we know with this COVID-19, the within country income distributions gaps have widened seriously. And while of course it is an economic development challenge, it's also a big social stability challenge, or can become. And these challenges or this need to recover faces the hurdle of climate change. Frankly, the dialogue on climate change is nothing new. It's just that right now we're being called to order and reminded that we're not really doing much. And I'll tell you a little bit of what we have looked at, and maybe also share some paper after this event that could be interesting. But the other one, there is another challenge which can also bring great opportunities, the digital transformation. Of course, it's been overshadowed a little bit by the climate change and the recent COP26, and it's very important. But the digital transformation is another big challenge, not so much in terms of growth, perhaps, but again, in terms of the winners and losers among countries and within countries. So these are the big themes that are keeping also the macroeconomists occupied, while we are focusing also on helping countries to maintain fiscal stability, a fiscal sustainable path. And that's where it's, I think I will link now to the discussion on tax and spending. The big challenge is how to mobilize resources and including domestic revenues, while at the same time not hampering growth. That's exactly what I think some of you have discussed. And let me just give you an overview of two things. One is that we have analyzed the tax and public spending measures over all the countries that are members of the World Bank, and also the IMF has done the same, but we've issued a paper and we assess all the policy measures that countries have undertaken to help on the containment of the COVID-19 crisis and then on the recovery. And what is interesting is that some countries have taken up to 54 tax measures in terms of reducing tax rates, creating tax breaks, giving tax deferrals, a lot of issues. Some are easy to reverse. Others are really not easy to reverse at all. And so that's one problem that we see, in particular in our emerging economies, they're faced. And I would say the position here is not so much to increase tax rates, because I would agree that at this point in time would not be politically really feasible, but also if there's not the optimal policy mix, it's really also difficult to implement in a phase of low growth or recovery phase. But there is a lot of opportunities we have realized to broaden the tax base, meaning to remove special treatments for special groups. And that's something that we are focusing a lot. We also have developed a number of tools. Professor, stop me when you think I've overpassed. I just want to give you an overview of where we are trying to focus, because it's, and frankly, I'm trying to give you a sense of challenges that are pretty much faced by all countries, I would say. Then we can nuance, then country context matters, but the temptation to give tax breaks to special groups.
Я прошу извинения, но в течение минуты, максимум двух.
Within 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay.
We only have 3 to 4 minutes to one discussion.
Okay, thank you. So this is an area that we're really analyzing. And the other one is the quality of spending. So again, in the expansionary fiscal policy that felt necessary in the containment of the crisis, not everything was, or not all spending went either for social purposes or to protect the productive sector. And I think this is an area that needs to be analyzed very carefully, because there is a need to provide public spending. This is the time actually where the government, the public sector becomes really important in a crisis or post-crisis phase. But at the time, we need to be able to choose the right areas of spending. And what we have also found that in this recovery phase and this expansionary measures, countries that were on a brown path, meaning not really taking any policy for decarbonization, have not taken advantage of the large amounts of resources put in the system to at least try to transform. They basically put more. Whereas countries that were coming already with policies in place pre-COVID, where they were really trying to reorganize the production processes to also move away from a highly carbonized environment or production system, have been able actually through the recovery phase, the expansionary phase to help the economy, to promote greener. So just these 3 areas of that we can consider. So taxation, quality of spending, and then which spending for which development path. Over to you. Thank you.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. Let me give the floor to Yevsey Gurvich, head of the economic expert group. Those working in Russia know Yevsey very well as a very successful academic and practitioner with regard to fiscal policies, macro policies, particularly the person who has been successfully interacting with the Ministry of Finance. In which ivory tower are you now? Academic tower or Ministry of Finance? 3 to 4 minutes. Thank you very much. I'm still playing a role of an academic, of an expert. And thank you very much to our speaker for the interesting presentation. Ideally, there should be a path from scholarship, from science to practice. Should be like in technology. First, basic research, then applied research, development, and implementation. In Russia, it has never worked for many reasons. there was no subject matter, the market economy. And when the reforms were started in 90s, but basic economic science before aimed at criticizing market economy. Before that, but not embracing market economy or analysis of market economy. Therefore, in Russia, we have seen a change of several forms. Initially, the scholars came to the government, economists came to the government with the use of foreign economists like Jeffrey Sachs. And then there were international financial organizations, institutions that came in with their experts, and then mega centers came in, were set up both with research, analytics, and education, like HSE and Russian Academy of Sciences. And now some institutions and departments set up inside, within themselves. Department of Research, for instance, in the Central Bank of Russia, which is one of the most potent, powerful research centers in economic and banking system. The way it works today, number one, still there is a high demand on the part of the government for economic scholarly analysis and research. But at the same time, the momentum impetus comes from the authorities normally. The authorities have, the government has its agenda politically formulated at the political level. And mainly the authorities want to know how to achieve the goals and tasks they have. Primarily now, it's not building or rebuilding the economic system, but rather its optimization. And within this agenda, the government is ready to listen to initiatives and proposals coming from science, from scholarship, and from academia. And it is often done, and there are a number of channels through which you can communicate these proposals to the government. And the government is in contact and regularly seeking advice from experts, has its own think centers. Ministry of Finance has its own center, and HSE is cooperating with, interacting with, and the Russian Academy of Public Administration and National Economy. Let me note that one of the major mechanisms for the authorities' work is correcting mistakes, analyzing the problems that occurred, emerged, analysis of new possible challenges, and analysis of options for solving, handling those problems and meeting those challenges. In Russia, due to its dependence, Russia's dependence on the openness of Russian economy, there were several crises. We are amidst one of them, together with the rest of the world, the pandemic-related crisis. And the macroeconomic policy has cast a long path, particularly in analyzing the past mistakes, which were reflected upon well by scholars, by academics, with good and right conclusions made. And as a result, whereas in 2008 and 9, after the crisis of 2008, the Russian economy, based on the results, was one of the worst. In the pandemic time, 2020, economic results, if not were best, but much better than the average among comparable countries. there is, of course, an untapped potential. For instance, in Russia, there are 85 or so regions, subnational regions, which would create conditions for experimentation and analysis of those pilot experiments. This is becoming popular now, kind of evidence-based economics, virtually. And many new approaches to economic governance, to tax policies are being trialed and tested experimentally in regions. It's come top to bottom. Unfortunately, there's not much room for experimentation coming from the regions, from the bottom, which could be then utilized to extend. I think our economic science, economics is mature enough. The last thing on the forefront in economic science is political economy. The main issue today is to propose options for optimizing the economic policy that would be acceptable by the government, that would not be blocked by interest groups, and would be serve improvement with not many losers. Not 3 to 4 minutes. Please try to be within 3 to 4 minute limit. I would argue, take issue with regard to high efficiency and effectiveness of the passage through the crisis by Russia. There are some institutional factors that are seen at the micro level. Nevertheless, we continue with the discussion. You have touched upon an important matter, a topic, interaction between, and the way they build between the expert community, between the government, the formats of this interaction. Let me give the floor to Vasily Burov. I would not name his position. He's the kind of person that brings together people around himself, practitioners, academics. He's You're welcome. It was so fascinating to listen to what Ellen has to say about how well in Canada autonomous ideas get implemented. But at the same time, I was thinking how, from my experience, from my colleagues' experience, we see, I can speak about Germany, perhaps, and Russia. There are countries of officials, countries of experts. Two sides, rather. One side is experts, the other is authorities. And the most widespread story is where officials, it could be economists, have some established opinions, beliefs as to what is to be done based on what they think. And quite often, these considerations are not political. They could be called academic. They share a certain theory, perhaps, and people can't come to terms. A second story, it's more like Russian story, where quite often officials speaking to experts, economists, say, okay, now give us a plan, a specific plan, program, point by point. That's fine, but most academics are not capable of making this plan to be implementable within the system of the state. It's not their competence. The way I heard Alan's presentation, the situation is so good in Canada that they can find this specific competence and bridge the gap. But it's not a universal practice. In Russia, this happens so seldom, but particularly seldom when, and rarely when we talk about sectoral economic policy. Things are going not very easily there. Microeconomically, in finance, you've said, Gurvich copes and manages in sectoral dimensions. It's not so easy. I try to be with the 2 minutes. These are important things. When I heard Lev, I had some hints, Lev Jakobson. I think it's important, maybe, Yuri, we should make a more concentrated conversation in that direction. The different countries find different ways of having interaction. If we find a wonderful speaker ready to speak on this based on his or her experience, of course, we'll do that. We only have 15 minutes. I would now give the floor to two discussants. Vasily actually has led us to this paradox that it's not so good when decision makers in economic policy are economists by education. It is more challenging to convince them or reconvince them. Sometimes they go by dated economic theories. And then arguing with economists. Now I give the floor to Rahim Ashakbayev, since we're trying to make this club international with so many people joining in from post-Soviet countries.
3 or 4 minutes for you. It's my here's the director of the Center of Applied Research from Kazakhstan. I would like to congratulate you on the Economist Day. I'm a graduate of the economics department of the Moscow University. I used to be an aide to the Prime Minister of Kazakhstan. I participated in a number of negotiations, and I agree with Basil because at some point practical issues and trade-offs of political nature, communication nature, and current situation do not allow us to apply all economic postures for practice. And in research on scientific publications, nothing much is talked about a political dimension. And if there are policymakers with economic or without economic education, it brings us to a paradigm. In Kazakhstan, we were guided by a Laffer curve and taxes on the right from the optimal point, and on the other hand, there are administrative measures, and as a result, we will have a positive effect and improve the situation with a gray zone. And in terms of communications, it requires a great effort in order to be connected to that economic theory and to talk policymakers such as Prime Minister, Vice Prime Ministers to adopt that policy. First, we raised that point in 2017, and only in 2021, the president took a decision to combine all the taxes and reduce the average amount. That's the specific case, specific example, saying that academic theory is quite important, but there is a great gap between the two towers. And finally, I would respond to the challenge that we're faced with, and meaning to what extent it is still reasonable to target the economic growth. 2-3 years ago in Davos, it was criticized the long-termism or short-termism were identified as different things, and that it was stated that GDPism brings to inequality. So in Kazakhstan, we are trying to get rid of GDPism and switch to positive things, a green agenda. And in order to be serious about carbon neutrality, we don't have to target the growth. And I think on that, from that perspective, policymakers have a great demand, in our opinion. Thank you. Leo, the floor is yours. 2-3 minutes. I asked for opportunity to speak to balance a month. I mentioned a month which is really needed. It has to do with some constraints. Economists' capabilities are not unlimited, even if they are the great authorities on the subject. And perhaps I'll think of some values that are quite visible and reasonable. So my point is, first, the economics, economic science cannot give you a clear answer of what to do. And cases of Professor Paquet are not typical. Those are the cases of his experience as an elected member. He votes for some initiative and I propose something, I substantiate that, but normally the agenda of the executive power is the responses to challenges. It's not something that is inspired or initialized. And I'm convinced that the theory does not give you an action plan. Rather, it gives you some guidelines of what not to be done. And if a policy is negative, the economist can explain why it is. And our colleague from Kazakhstan spoke of specific cases. And he really clearly showed what is not to be done. And because many times we have to rely on intuition, but people with economic education and economic knowledge, because are strong here, because you cannot substitute for your knowledge. I can explain, I can explore that topic for many minutes and hours, but in a nutshell, really, the executive power thinks that 1/4 of the answer to the challenge is provided by the academic or empiric theory, but 3/4 comes from the political situation. And we are in a crisis. We are trying to overcome that crisis, and we are aware of the reasons, and there are some other structural factors. But I would like to end up on an optimistic note. Economics is useful, especially for politics. Thank you, Leo. And I don't think that it's the last session of the club. So next time I'll give you more time to speak on your ideas. Dear colleagues, it's time to wrap up the discussion. And here comes my call on Alain Paquet, who does have a right to say something in conclusion and probably to respond to some points. But Alan, I beg you not to extend it for 5 minutes, otherwise we will be broke. 5 minutes, please.
Spasiba. So thank you, I think, for the interesting points that have been raised by all the participants, and I really appreciate them. Obviously, first, I mean, the examples I gave 2 examples that worked out. I said I could give you some examples that work out as well, but I think the principles I experienced, I mean, thought of it in terms of not sufficient but necessary conditions to be able to implement successful policies. I think I was able to I mean, my experience, I mean, suggests to me there are some parameters that are useful and are necessary, even though they're not sufficient. One of the important conditions as well is to have a government leaders who are willing to listen. It doesn't mean they have to agree and to implement everything economists propose. And obviously, that won't be the case. They have other imperatives to consider as well in terms of balance of the inconvenience and in terms of all the trade-offs that have to be taken into account. I was fortunate that, I mean, it happened that, I mean, in the time span, in my experience, I had a leader who was not an economist from training. The premier was a lawyer from training, but he was very interested and keen in knowing about economics. Of course, I would not get there in his office with drawing graphs or resolving a simultaneous system of differential equations in probabilistic terms. I would not have gone very far. He would have kicked me out of his office very quickly. So that was the idea of translating it in terms of ways of, and talking to the civil servants as well, to at least to bring to the forefront, at least as Mr. Jacobson mentioned, in the sense, I mean, that sometimes economics has more to say about what not to do. And that's a starting and very useful point that need to be taken into account. And the idea in terms of, I mean, not only GDP matters, I agree, but we know that, I mean, my experience and my priors there in terms of normative view is in a world without growth, we're condemned to share misery. I mean, it doesn't mean we should be making growth in any ways and destroy and burn the Amazonia. It's not what I'm saying, obviously not. We need to take into account, to implement, to internalize the cost of negative impact of growth, of some growth, of bad growth, and need to find the best ways to do it. But I would say that, I mean, that I think the issues, I mean, and of course, the COVID crisis we're facing, the digital change in the economy transformation, Mrs. Bronke mentioned, the shifts also, even after COVID, people will internalize now the probability of having another pandemics in a lifetime future has increased, at least our perceived probability, and I think the realistic probability was always higher, but not at least we realize that it's there. So we're learning from that. This will change the propensity to save for precautionary motives, for instance, in populations. It would change the time. We have shifts in terms of demands for goods versus services, at least in the current while. And given, and we see the crisis of the container crisis in terms of the that affects the world right now, and there will be some lasting change out of that. So all this means we need to adapt, of course, to situations and shocks and exogenous shocks that we're hit with. But I think that in that sense, I mean, that we need to share. I think it's important thing is to not only to trade goods and services, but trade ideas, trade experiences, goods and bads. We can all learn from one another. We need to share the problems in order to share the solutions. And I think that's I would say the optimistic view, but I think that's the best view we can have in a world which is challenged all the time. And that, I mean, and I think that, I mean, overall, over many hundreds and thousands of years, I think things have been going better. But I mean, everything is going better, is getting better, obviously not. And sometimes we repeat, human beings being creatures of habits, we repeat sometimes bad and good habits over time. I think we're all somewhat guilty of that. I'm guilty of that myself. I would talk for myself, not for you guys. And but I think that the lessons from economics, I mean, are useful. Not only economics matters, and economics is an issue. One of the big misunderstandings for people sometimes, and policymakers and governments, is that sometimes people think that, and laymen think that economists only talk about money. Money is a unit of account. What matters is welfare. And I think that sometimes we're not always as good to carry and to convey that message. I think we need to work on that as well. So I thank you very much for the settlement. I could give you some bad examples that didn't work out. I chose two of them, and I didn't mean to say Canada is not a perfect example, and it's not what I went to convey. There have been some good examples, and there are plenty of bad examples I could have talked about. That would take a lot of things I'm unhappy about what's going on in Canada and in Quebec, and we can improve on. And we face common challenges in that regard. So thank you very much. Большое спасибо всем. Надеюсь увидеть вас в
Ален, громадное спасибо. Я позволю себе поймать вас на
Alan,
слове.
thanks a lot. Well, take your word. I'm taking your word that you have a lot of bad cases too. But I hope that we cannot be confined by nowadays. And sometime later, a year later, and the economists, they love negative examples, negative cases. They think that if you know in cases and information what not to be done, you are better off. And probably later on, a year later or so, we will revisit this particular topic, and you will really share your views on that. And this time, I would like to thank Professor Paquet for most interesting presentation. I'd like to thank Vesel Veselov, whose idea to invite the professor worked, and really we enjoyed the session. I would like to thank our discussant, to those who asked questions. We received a lot of interesting questions, and we will keep them. And Professor, you will also receive those questions from the chat. Perhaps you'll find something interesting. Sure. Looking into the future, we tried. We believe we need some period of rest, abstention from the sessions. But on November 25, we are going to have Professor Oberhemp from France, and also he is a professor of HSE. Professor Camp used to be an official in the Bank of France. He's an authority on the central bank's operations. He offered a number of topics for discussions, and we picked the most controversial topic of greening the monetary policy. So that monetary policy is to be integrated into the green efforts. Colleagues, you are all invited to be present at the session. And if you have some ideas how to improve the work of the club, how to make it more efficient, you are all welcome. And we are open to all ideas, to all proposals. So, dear colleagues, I wonder if you have any important comments to make. No, I talked a lot. My final word is that it's an extremely interesting presentation that we had, and based on questions and discussions, the list was very long. The presentation provoked a lot of ideas, a lot of considerations. Professor talked about incentives, and it came to us that incentives is something that is to be revisited, and a second thought is to be given to that topic. Thank you. Alan, hope that you will join the club next time, if possible, if you have an interest to that, and if you have time, since it's our desire to invite people who combine academic and practitioners, those people who was in government, in policy making. Otherwise, I would like to thank all the participants. You are all invited to visit the web page. of the club, and you can read the materials and watch video recording. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will always be grateful for your questions, for your ideas. Thank you.
До свидания. До скорого. Москве.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Пожалуйста.